There's an unspoken rule in some families. Love and attention aren't always distributed equally. In some, one child becomes the golden child, basking in the glow of favoritism, while the other quietly fades into the background. That was the reality of my family, until things took a sudden and unexpected turn. On the outside, our family seemed picture perfect. A loving mother, a dedicated father, two daughters, me, Ashley, and my younger sister Emily. But behind the closed doors, the tension was palpable, and I was growing more and more invisible. Emily, with her vivacious personality, was always my mother's pride, leaving me to quietly observe from the sidelines. Little did I know that the favoring hand of our mother would be the first crack in what would eventually tear our family apart. From the moment Emily was born, it was clear who would be the golden child in our family. My sister, outgoing and charming, was always the center of attention. Every smile and every joke she cracked would light up the room, making it impossible not to be drawn to her. She had our mother's eyes, and I could see the admiration in my mother's gaze whenever Emily was around. As for me, I was quieter, more reserved, and I never seemed to catch my mother's eye the way Emily did. From an early age, I started to feel overlooked. While Emily was the one who went on trips with our mom, I was the one left behind, often hearing that I was too plain or boring to be introduced to their friends. Our family outings, instead of being fun bonding experiences, became painful reminders that Emily was the favorite. But it wasn't just the way my mother adored Emily, it was how she actively ignored me. When Emily excelled in school or made friends easily, my mother would beam with pride, while I could only watch in silence. It wasn't that I wasn't trying, but my efforts never seemed to be enough to catch her attention. I started to wonder if I was the one who was somehow wrong for not being more like Emily. Amidst the tension, there was one constant in my life: my dad. Unlike my mother, who seemed to favor Emily, Dad made sure to love and support both of us equally. He never played favorites and always gave us both the attention we needed. While my mother might have overlooked me, my dad would always take the time to listen, to show interest in my day, and to remind me how much he appreciated my sincerity. He treated us the same, and that fairness became my anchor in a house where I often felt invisible. While Emily was out having fun with our mom, Dad would spend time with me, even if it was just watching a movie together or talking about our day. The fact that Dad always treated me equally was the one thing that kept me grounded and hopeful. In a way, he became my rock, the only one who saw me for who I truly was, and that gave me the strength to continue. While my mother's bias created a rift between us, my father's love kept me from falling too far into despair. I found comfort in the idea that, no matter what, I had his unwavering support. When Dad retired at the age of 65, the dynamics of our family began to shift. It wasn't just the fact that he wasn't working anymore. It was the way he started to change. One day, he stumbled on a small step while trying to do some gardening, and in the blink of an eye, everything seemed to fall apart. Dad broke his leg, and while the surgery was successful, his recovery was slow and painful. His muscles had started to weaken due to age, and he became more dependent on others for basic needs. What hurt the most was the way my mother and Emily responded to his injury. As the months passed, their indifference toward Dad grew. Instead of helping him, they started to grow more distant, spending their time doing other things, like going on trips and enjoying themselves, leaving Dad to fend for himself. I was the one who stepped up, taking on the role of his primary caregiver. But the burden wasn't easy to carry. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't do it alone. I reached out to care services for help, but it was clear that my mother and sister didn't care about Dad the way I did. The emotional weight of the situation started to take its toll on me. and I began to feel like I was living in a house where only my father and I existed. It was then that I realized how much things had changed and how much my family had begun to unravel. One evening, as I walked into the living room, I overheard my mother and Emily excitedly discussing a family trip. At first, I assumed it would be the usual family outing we had done in the past. But then I heard them mention that it was going to be just the two of them. Confused, I asked, "What about Dad? Isn't he coming too?" To my shock, my mother looked at me with a slight frown, almost as if she was annoyed by my interruption. "Well, your father's mobility is an issue now. We're not sure how he would manage the trip," she said dismissively. As I pressed further, Emily gave me a cold, almost smug smile. "We're not bringing him. We'll just leave him at home. It'll be easier for everyone that way." The moment those words left her lips, it was as if time stood still. My heart sank, and I could feel a mix of anger and disbelief rise within me. How could they just leave Dad behind? He had always been there for us, and now they were abandoning him in his time of need. Without thinking, I said, "If you're not taking Dad, then I won't go either. I'll stay behind and care for him." I wasn't sure what the future would hold, but at that moment, I knew I had to make the right choice. Caring for my father wasn't an easy task, especially as his condition worsened. Every day felt like a balancing act between my job and the demands of caregiving. I would rush home from work, only to find my father sitting quietly in his chair, waiting for me to attend to his needs. He needed help with basic things: eating, bathing, and even walking short distances. I quickly realized that, despite my best efforts, I couldn't do it all on my own. So, I hired care services to assist with the physical tasks, such as helping him bathe or accompany him on walks around the neighborhood. But no matter how many times I reached out for help, neither my mother nor Emily showed any real interest in helping. They would go on one trip after another, enjoying their lives while I stayed behind, pouring all my energy into my father's care. It hurt, more than they knew. The emotional toll was heavy. I couldn't understand how they could be so indifferent. My dad, who had given everything to support us, was now being treated like an afterthought. While my mother and Emily reveled in their freedom, I was stuck, watching the man I loved slowly fade away. There were moments when I resented them, resented how they left me to shoulder the burden alone. I had no time for myself, no time to rest. I was becoming exhausted, physically and emotionally. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't abandon my father when he needed me most, even if my family had already turned their backs on him. It was a cold winter morning when I took Dad to the doctor, expecting a routine checkup. But when the doctor's words hit me, they felt like a punch to the gut. "Your father's condition has worsened," the doctor said gravely. "He has advanced cancer. Unfortunately, it's terminal." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My father, the man who had always been there for me, was now facing something I couldn't change. I tried to hold back tears, but they came anyway. I couldn't let him face this alone. I couldn't allow him to suffer without doing everything I could to help. I knew then that I had to make a decision. I couldn't continue working while taking care of my father. It was a difficult choice, but I knew it was the right one. I decided to quit my job and become my father's full-time caregiver. I would be there for him every step of the way, through the pain, the fear, and the uncertainty. No one else was going to step up, but I had no choice but to do it. When I finally told my mom and Emily about Dad's diagnosis and my decision to quit my job to care for him, I expected some level of concern or sympathy. But what I received was nothing short of shocking. My mother barely looked up from her phone. "Oh, really?" she muttered, her voice flat. "Well, I guess that's your choice." Emily, on the other hand, gave me a brief, uninterested glance before shrugging. "I wouldn't give up my job for Dad, that's for sure." she said, as if discussing a trivial matter, not the life of our father. I stood there, stunned. How could they be so indifferent? I had made the hardest decision of my life, and yet it seemed to mean nothing to them. They were far more interested in their own plans, their own lives, than in the person who had given so much for us. The emotional distance between us grew with each passing day. As I watched them ignore the reality of the situation, it became clear that the bond I once thought we shared had been shattered. My sacrifices, my devotion to Dad, none of it mattered to them. It was the final confirmation that I was alone in this. Despite all my efforts, Dad's condition continued to deteriorate. The chemotherapy treatments were tough on him, but he remained strong, always trying to smile for me. I had hoped for a miracle, but as the days went on, it became clear that the inevitable was coming. When Dad passed away quietly in his sleep, it felt like a part of me had died with him. The grief was overwhelming, but it was also tinged with anger. I had cared for him so deeply, and yet I knew that my family's response to his death would be just as detached as everything else. The funeral preparations were my responsibility. Once again, I found myself alone. My mother and Emily disappeared as usual, only showing up when it was time to dress up for the ceremony. I didn't hear a word of comfort from either of them. I was left to make all the arrangements, finding a funeral home, picking out a casket, writing the eulogy, everything. And then, at the funeral, my mother, who had done nothing but disappear throughout the entire process, took the stage to give the chief mourner's speech. She spoke as though she had been the one to care for Dad all those years. My anger boiled inside me as she pretended to be the grieving wife, while I stood silently, seething with frustration. The funeral was barely over when my mother and Emily began discussing the inheritance. They didn't even give me time to mourn. They came to me with wide, triumphant grins on their faces. "We've already talked about it," my mother said, her voice sharp. "Emily and I will inherit everything. The house, the assets, everything." I was stunned. My father had always been so fair to all of us, so how could he have left me out? I couldn't comprehend what they were saying. My heart sank as Emily proudly waved a piece of paper in front of me. "Dad signed this will just before he went into the hospital. It says that you won't get a penny. Not a single thing," she said with a cold smile. The words felt like a slap across my face. Everything I had done, the years of sacrifice, the caregiving, the pain I had endured, meant nothing. My father's love had been replaced by a cold legal document. "You'll be fine. You're the one who gave up everything to care for him. But look at us now. We're the ones getting everything," Emily continued, her voice oozing with smugness. I felt a wave of betrayal wash over me. I had thought my father's love was something no one could take away, but now it seemed like everything I had believed in had been stripped from me. The day came when I couldn't hold back any longer. The weight of everything, years of neglect, betrayal, and the crushing realization that my family didn't care about me, had built up inside me. I stood in the living room, facing my mother and Emily, who were already arguing about the inheritance. "I'm done," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I've given everything for this family, and you've taken it all for granted. I can't do this anymore." My mother barely looked up. "You should leave then. We don't need your drama." Emily nodded in agreement, her face expressionless. They didn't even seem to care. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused me, just cold indifference. I stood there, a rush of emotion flooding me. Anger, hurt, relief. "I'm leaving. For good. I'll never come back," I declared. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door. The finality of my decision hit me, but it also felt liberating. I was done. No more sacrificing for people who couldn't even pretend to care. It was time to reclaim my life. The weeks after I left were quiet but fulfilling. As I settled into my new life with Sean, I learned that Emily and my mother's world began to unravel. They weren't as invincible as they had thought. Without my presence, the family's finances quickly deteriorated. Emily, who had always coasted by, found herself in deep financial trouble. She returned to her job, but her relationships with colleagues became strained. Her selfishness had alienated everyone, and no one was willing to offer her the support she had once relied on. My mother, too, struggled. She couldn't find another job. Her age worked against her, and her attitude had made her unapproachable. She quickly ran out of savings, and the comfort she had lived in for so long slipped away. Meanwhile, Sean and I built a life filled with love, respect, and stability. I found peace in the little things, like sharing a cup of coffee with him in the mornings or cooking dinner together. I had the emotional support I'd always craved, and I realized what it truly felt like to be valued. Though I missed my father terribly, I found comfort in knowing that he would be proud of me for finally standing up for myself. His love was the only constant in a world of betrayal. Looking back, I'm at peace with my decision to leave. I no longer carry the weight of my mother's and Emily's toxicity. I've built a life of my own, one filled with love and respect. I reflect on how much my father supported me, even when no one else did. His love is the reason I have the strength to move forward. The lesson I've learned is simple. Family isn't always about blood. It's about love, loyalty, and respect. We owe it to ourselves to set boundaries and stand up for our happiness, no matter the cost.